Hi, everyone. My name is Elisa Martinez. I am an online anxiety and trauma psychotherapist, and I love to work with the thinkers, the doers, and burned out professionals who struggle a lot with worry and also with being a bit hard on themselves. And in the world of therapy and personal growth, there are tons of avenues for self-exploration and healing. And I like to share some of these with you through informal interviews and chats that I have with other therapists and healers. So today, I am joined by Dreya Blume. Dreya is a licensed clinical social worker who loves to use tarot in therapy. And today that's what we're going to be talking about, using tarot in therapy. And Dreya is also the author of the Tarot Activity Book, which I want to mention too. So welcome, Dreya. Thank you so much for joining us.
Elisa, thank you for the invitation.
Yeah,
I'm grateful to be here.
yeah. So thinking about tarot, first of all, I know there's a couple of ways to say it. I hear people say tarot, and then I hear people say tarot. How do you say
I say tarot, but you're right. There's all sorts, and it's when somebody says tarot,
it? No,
'cause
no,
I
not
know,
tarot.
and like that's why I love Spanish because what you see
Yeah.
is what you say. I understand why someone might say that, but any way a person says it is okay.
Yeah. So, and a lot of times when we think about tarot, we think about, the tarot deck. And I have a couple of tarot decks here, as I'm sure you do with you there too.
I do.
Um,
What do you have? What you got?
I have this, the traditional Rider-Waite tarot deck.
Yeah,
Um, and there are a gazillion other decks, as you know.
literally,
Um,
yes.
yeah. And a lot of times when we think about tarot as like this tool for telling the future and divination. Um, and while there can be an element of, I guess some element of that in the use of tarot, um, it can also be this really wonderful tool for self-insight that more and more therapists are actually using, not only for themselves, but in their work with clients who want to do this other kind of exploration. So just wondering if you could speak a little bit to, your experience with that, your thoughts.
Oh, Lisa, I love how you set that up because
Yeah.
it's really interesting. Like you say, a lot of people think of tarot, it's this loaded word where people
Mm-hmm.
immediately think of fortune telling and they might have this image in their head of somebody, of a certain kind of person. And for some people, they love that.
Mm-hmm.
And they get their cards read,
Mm-hmm.
every so often. And for other people, though, it's loaded where it could be because of their religious upbringing or because of things they've seen in movies where there's this fear or disdain uh, that's just encapsulated in that word. And so they have a knee-jerk reaction to it. But what I think is super cool and why I love tarot is that you've got these 78 cards, and each one has rich imagery. So 78 cards with rich imagery. And so I love art therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that's my inspiration. Everything that I do is informed by what has come before me in terms of how art therapists have used imagery as a way to assist people in connecting with their intuition. And so when I say art therapy, at the same time, I'm thinking about the Rorschach test, so ink blot,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of funny. We don't really use that anymore, but it's the idea that when you look at, and most people have a sense of, oh yeah, you look at
Mm-hmm.
this ink blot, say what
Mm-hmm.
comes to mind, and now we're going to analyze you. Um, but it's this, I mean, the term is a projective device, right?
Yes.
Right, ambiguous stimuli that
Mm-hmm.
there's something that if you look at it because of who you are and what you've experienced, different things are going to come up for you based on you engaging with this imagery that you're looking at. And I could be
Mhm.
looking at the same imagery, and yet because
Mhm.
of my background,
Mhm.
different things are going to come up for me. And so when I think about using the cards as a tool,
Mhm.
because there's 78 of them, and because on each of those cards there's some different aspect of life represented, and I'll use the
Mhm.
word again, it's there's a richness there.
Mhm.
So I've always thought, why aren't we using this more? And it's tailor made for things like internal family systems and narrative
Mhm.
therapy, certainly because you can tell stories with the cards, or cards can represent different parts of ourselves.
Right.
But I do think people have a very, some people, and maybe a small minority, but they can be
Mhm.
vocal
Mhm.
as far as, again, if I mention I'm using tarot, they just immediately assume that I'm reading the fortune of my client. They say, oh, that's
Right.
unethical. I'm like, no, well,
Right.
that's not what I'm doing. And sometimes they hear me, sometimes they don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And thank you for that wonderful explanation. And it just reminds me how tarot, well, first of all, um, I do have an interest in tarot, using it in a lot of the same way that you are talking about. And I also have some clients who have expressed interest in tarot. And with, a few of those clients, we've done a thing where we pull a card, right? Not so much for the sake of like, let's tell your future, but let's look at this card and let's look at the imagery here, right? What's coming up for you? What are you noticing about yourself? What's it making you think of, right? And so much, it can be such a way inside, right? For lots of self-exploration, a lot of insight can just organically come up out of that, right? So again, it's not everyone's cup of tea, and it's not certainly something that we, push on our clients at all. Again, but we do have, I know I've worked with some folks who actually want that, right? And who
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
it can be a very useful tool. So yeah, so I'm wondering, anything else that you want to speak to, whether it's, what does it look like in a session, for example? Like I just gave a real brief example of how I have used it before. But yeah, anything else you want to share about that?
Yeah, that's a great question because there are so many ways, and I appreciate you mentioning my book. When I
Mm-hmm.
first started about 20 years ago, I was thinking, well, I know because people were writing about tarot from a psychological perspective, from a Jungian perspective,
Mm-hmm.
looking at archetypes, but as far as practical ways to actually use it in session, there just wasn't any info out there. And again, that's where I was inspired by the art therapists because they
Mm-hmm.
have tons of books with activities. This is the goal, this is the tree, this is
Mm-hmm.
how it relates to whatever the issue is. So I thought, oh, okay, I'll use that inspiration to create just a whole bunch of
Mm-hmm.
ideas. And so I'll give you I'll give you one that I think can be super powerful because there are really two ways to use the cards broadly in session.
Mm-hmm.
And one way is to have the client. Now, obviously, this depends if you're in person or remote.
Mm-hmm.
Ideally, you're in person, but if it doesn't matter, I work remote, and I have a document camera, and so I can share the screen, and um, instead of holding the card up to the camera with the
Mm-hmm.
document camera, it shows what's ever on my desk in a very clear,
Mm-hmm.
broad way. So, I can certainly ask a client to choose a card, quote at random,
Mm-hmm.
and I can do that for them. I'll
Mm-hmm.
say, tell me when to stop, and I'm going to take the bottom card. So this idea of choosing a card at random, and I
Mm-hmm.
use quotes because I happen to believe that there's some sort of intelligence going on. There's something happening.
Some kind of
And
synchronicity there. Yeah.
yeah, I really
Yeah.
believe it. And so you
Yeah.
can ask questions like, what's something, as the client, what's something that I, as the client, should be focusing on right now? So
Mm,
in light of what maybe we're talking about boundaries, talking about maybe a decision I have to make.
mhm,
In light of the theme of the session, what's something I need to focus on that perhaps hasn't been on my radar? And so we can have the card chosen at random and then engage with whatever comes up that way. Now, the second manner in which we can do it is to actually deliberately go through the deck. And
mm,
yeah, one of my favorite ways to do, well, there's so many, but one that I enjoy is so if you were my client, I could ask you. Now this works if you have your own deck or if we're in my office and I can give you a deck to look through. But a lot of people will use an app. There
mhm,
are many tarot apps out there with
yeah,
different decks, so
mhm,
they can go through it. But I would ask you to do three things. You're going to pick three cards
mhm,
deliberately,
mhm,
and the first card is going to represent the problem, right? The
mhm,
issue that you're struggling with.
mhm,
And then the second card is going to represent the solution
mhm,
to this problem.
mhm,
And then the third card that you're going to look through to pick which one, the third card will represent you,
mm,
Lisa,
mhm,
without the problem on the other
mm,
side of it. So it's interesting as the client does this work, as they're looking through each card, they're thinking about the issue in a different way because they're asking, right, what card matches, what card has the energy, the imagery that really would
mhm,
express these
mhm.
prompts. And so they learn a lot about themselves, and then as the clinician, we are learning a lot about them and their process. So those are just two
Yeah.
ways to do it. Yeah.
And so when you say they're picking the card deliberately, I'm understanding it to mean where they're looking through all the cards in the deck and then consciously going, okay, this one maybe matches the issue, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so they're looking at all of the cards on the in the deck.
Yeah.
And I know when I've worked with some clients, we've done things similar to that where they'll have the cards out in front of them, right? And so it can
Yeah.
be really helpful for if you're online like I am, right? If your client has a deck, but it's also, I think, possible if they don't, right? But there's maybe some
Yeah.
logistical things.
Yeah.
Another, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was agreeing. Like, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Another thing that comes to mind too, because I'm all about the neuroscience of therapy because I work a ton with anxiety and trauma and all of its many shades and forms. Um, I know a fair amount about the neuroscience of how healing can work, how trauma happens, and so forth. Um, and when we are engaging, it's like with art therapy, right? When we are engaging with this imagery, we're really kind of tapping into this different part of the brain. We talk about left side of the brain, right side of the brain, right side being the more kind of creative, emotionally charged side of our brain. And it's not quite so either or as that, but we're really connecting with this different part of our brain, right? The part of our brain that dreams, the part of our brain
Yeah.
that thinks in symbols and imagery, right?
Mm,
Because a lot of times when we're trying to tackle and approach our problems, solve our problems, we're coming at it from our thinking brain, our prefrontal cortex here, which is wonderful. I mean, our thinking brain or the left side of the brain that is in charge of planning and judging and categorizing all things is wonderfully useful. But I feel like sometimes we can only be, or we can use kind of that left side, without really tapping into what that right side of the brain has to offer. So my long-winded way of saying that when we're using tarot, we're actually kind of tapping into that's part of the brain, right? That thinks in imagery and symbol, right? While we're also engaging our thinking brain at the same time. So I think it's a very, from a brain perspective, I think it's just a really neat way to explore. Yeah.
yeah, I agree. I love how you put that. It's interesting because it's such a an aphorism, like a saying, like a cliche, but I think it's true. This idea that a picture is worth 1,000 words, right?
Mm-hmm.
One
Mm-hmm.
picture is worth 1,000 words. And it's true because when somebody, in my experience, personally and professionally with clients, looking at the imagery, things immediately start coming up,
Right.
because you're just, and in a sense, sometimes because you're absolutely right, depending on the prompt, we're using both
Mm-hmm.
sides of our brain.
Mm-hmm.
And if I were to ask you, okay, just take a look at this card and what comes up for you, in that split second, as soon as you see the imagery, depending
Mm-hmm.
on what I'm asking, information is coming up. It's like we
Yes.
bypass the left side and we're going straight to deep,
Mm-hmm.
intuitive, soulful wisdom.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's why art therapy is so powerful, because the creative piece, right?
Mm-hmm.
It bypasses all that stuff. It bypasses our defenses, I guess you could say. It goes straight
Mm-hmm.
to the heart of the matter.
Yeah,
So yeah, it's powerful.
it is. And like you were saying earlier, you
Mm.
know, tarot can be so seamlessly integrated with other interventions that a
Mhm.
therapist might use, right? So
Yeah.
I've got, as a trauma and anxiety therapist, I have quite a few tools in my toolkit, right? I use EMDR and brain spotting, IFS, you know, a lot of creative somatic work. And tarot can just, it doesn't necessarily have to be this thing where like, oh, I'm just going to use tarot in my session. Although, hey, why not? If that is working and there's a lot of juicy exploration and insight and growth that's coming out of that. But I loved what you said about how it goes so well with other modalities. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. And so let me tell you my perspective, because I
Yeah.
love that you're bringing this up. My advice to people is you can put it in your informed consent, that
Mm.
if you're my client, I've got a menu of
Mm-hmm.
modalities. And depending on what the treatment plan is, depending on what your goals are, right, we can use
Mm-hmm.
EMDR, we can use brain spotting, we can use mindfulness, we can use tarot
Mm-hmm.
as a metaphorical, symbolic, intuitive tool. We can use X, we can use Y. So we don't necessarily hit a person over the head with it, but they understand. And I usually say, because our clients don't read the informed consent, it's a
Mm-hmm.
great opportunity the first session to say, hey, I'd just like to go over this to see if you have any questions. So
Yeah.
they see like, wow, Elisa,
Mm-hmm.
Dreya have a menu.
Mm-hmm.
And so then it opens it up. I mean, that to me is the nature of informed consent. If they've
Right.
signed it and agreed, they've given us permission now to say, oh, what do you think? We can do
Right.
this or we can do that. We can do tarot if you like, and see if it resonates.
Yeah.
But now they know that they can
Mm-hmm.
ask for it. Like,
Yeah.
oh, could we work with the cards today? But the other piece of that, it's funny because I used to live in Roanoke, Virginia, Southwest Virginia, right down the road from Liberty University, which has a biblical counseling
Mm-hmm.
master's program for LPCs, licensed professional counselors. So, it's interesting to me that biblical counseling gets a free pass, right? Christian
Mm.
counselors. And it's funny because people will tell me, well, tarot is not evidence based, so you shouldn't use it, which to me goes against everything
Mm.
that I believe that therapy can and should be. That
Mm-hmm.
there's so many ways to do it. And EMDR, I'm trained. I mean, EMDR
Mm-hmm.
absolutely has a place. But if you think about Carl Jung, right, and
Mm-hmm.
depth psychology, so then dream
Yes.
analysis has a place.
Right.
But it's interesting because my take is that if you're a believer in terms of being Christian,
Mm-hmm.
then why wouldn't biblical counseling work? And so that's
Mm.
valid. So if
Mm-hmm.
we have a client, and again, they get a free pass. Nobody's saying, "Oh, let's, kick the Christian counselors out of the field."
Right.
And so if one of our clients has a connection to tarot,
Mm.
and there's two things going on. Number one, if it's meaningful to them, then it can be therapeutic. I mean, that's how
Mhm.
I learned. That's how I was trained. You can do therapy with a toothbrush. I mean, if whatever is meaningful to the client becomes therapeutic.
Right.
And so this idea of measuring things scientifically, I have a lot of issue with that.
Yeah.
But right. But at the same time, though, the other piece that I think people miss is that if tarot is a part of your spiritual tradition, in other words, that
Mhm.
you are somebody who uses tarot in a way that is connected to your spirituality, my argument is we are ethically, right? We're ethically bound to incorporate that into our session. And if I
Mhm.
know nothing about tarot, then I need to learn. Just like
Right.
if you came to me and said, "Hey, I'm pagan or I'm Wiccan,"
Mhm.
I'm not going to say, "Well, I'm not going to see you anymore,"
Right.
because I don't believe in that. No, it's okay. I need to educate myself because I'm not going to make you educate me.
Right.
And so it's funny. I think people really lose the thread about what it is we're doing, and they get so hung up because it's a loaded word, tarot.
Mhm.
Um, and I think no, it's as legitimate as anything else in the field. And I think as more therapists are kind of showing up as their witchy selves, and as more
Mhm.
clients are, right, and me too. Um, yeah, I mean, we're meeting clients where they're at. So many clients
Yeah.
are they're scared because they don't want to be judged by their therapist, and then vice versa. I know therapists who don't want to disclose that they're interested in
Mhm.
tarot cards or they use them because they're afraid of being judged by clients.
Yes.
I just think that there's such potential for both clients and clinicians to show up fully and
Yes.
authentically. And I think we're moving in that direction.
Yes. Yes. And I think with the advent, of course, of social media, right, podcasting, right, I've discovered a ton of there's a ton of social media accounts of people who are, using tarot, right? And I think it's just becoming a lot more normalized where we are getting more educated about it, right? There's some wonderful, I think there's a really great podcast that is done by a couple of psychotherapists about using tarot, right?
Oh,
And
I
I
think I know. Yeah.
I can't remember the name off the top of
Is
my
it the
head.
tarot diagnosis?
Something like that, or something like
There's
that.
two of them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so I really appreciate what you're saying. This is, I think, such a rich conversation we're having about it. And I'm wondering too, so if somebody is a client or maybe thinking about being a client or even a therapist, right? And they're interested in like, wow, how do I maybe start exploring this, right? I'm kind of intrigued, you know? Um, and I know for me, one of the things I did was I just got a deck and I started doing a little bit of reading and learning. But I'm wondering what you would suggest as kind of like just an, easy way in, what for a
Hmm.
client or a therapist.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I'm most familiar when it comes to social media with YouTube.
Mm,
There are so many YouTubers who do deck walkthroughs, talk
mm-hmm,
about their tarot journey for
mm-hmm,
every level.
mm-hmm,
And so my advice is to do a search on YouTube.
mm-hmm,
Learn tarot. It's just
mm-hmm,
those keywords, and then find a channel that resonates
mm-hmm,
because not only can you learn about all of the different options when it comes to individual
mm-hmm,
decks, but also getting a sense of, well, how are people talking about using tarot? It's nice to hear those perspectives, especially if you resonate with the person
mm-hmm,
whose channel
mm-hmm,
it is. Now, for books, a really nice psychologically oriented book is 78 Degrees of Wisdom by Rachel Pollack. Yeah, there's a couple.
Mm, okay,
Yeah. So 78
okay.
Degrees of Wisdom is really the book that got me started. Um, and then Mary, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, we can put all of this in the notes too. Like,
Oh, great.
I
Okay.
might get some names from you, but
Yeah.
sorry. You were saying
No,
Mary.
no, no, no.
Yeah,
That'll be helpful. Yeah.
yeah.
So Rachel Pollack is a good gateway, but also Mary Greer. And
Okay.
so that'll be right as you said, that'll be in the notes. Mary
Hmm.
Greer has written a number of just classic books, and two that I think are great places to start from that really give you the sense of how to use tarot introspectively as opposed to
Hmm.
for reading fortunes.
Right.
21 Ways to Read a Tarot Card is one.
Okay.
And
Okay.
then Tarot for Yourself is another.
Okay.
So those are good
Okay.
books. I if you wanted to learn more traditional meanings, the book that
Mm-hmm.
also, so I read Rachel Pollack, but then the
Mm-hmm.
other way I really became grounded in those
Mm-hmm.
meanings is there's a book, oh, and I forget what it's called, but the author is Joan Bunning. And
Okay.
I can get that to you for the notes.
Yeah.
So Joan Bunning has a great beginner's book.
Mm.
And I just think there are so many books to choose from, and they all kind of say the same thing. I just feel like if I had to choose,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just like how she lays it
Yeah.
out.
Well, we're going to include all of this information in the notes too. Um, and before we sign off, and I know this is such a rich topic. I mean, you and I could talk a lot more. I have like questions about your book, right? All the things. Um, which again, you are the author of the Tarot Activity book, which is a book that has a bunch of different kind of standalone activities, right? That can be used in sessions, which is
Yeah.
wonderful. And that's available on Amazon and maybe other places too.
Yeah.
As we close, I'm wondering if there's anything else that you want to say to speak to, the use of tarot, whether for therapists, and clients, anything else that you want to add here?
Hmm. Oh, I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah.
For me, it really comes back to, well, two things. I would say being creative.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's something really beautiful about us, whether as a client or a clinician, engaging with our creativity,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very life-giving.
Yeah.
So incorporating that into the therapy room, I think is beautiful. And
Mm-hmm.
attached to that is this idea of magic.
Mm.
Just introducing this element of awe and magic, because what always happens is somebody looks at the imagery and they're like, oh my gosh, or the reaction is, I
Mm-hmm.
can't, this is perfect and I'm getting chills. And so there's something really
Mm-hmm.
special and magical about working with, I would argue, any kind of creative modality. Again, you and
Yeah.
I, like, EMDR absolutely heals, and I would never suggest not use any of that. I just think at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
introducing something or having the option to connect with something that can create a sense of magic and awe and ritual too,
Mm-hmm.
because it's a great way to close a session or open a session, pulling a card. Um, and I know our time's just about up, but as therapists, we are in this shamanic tradition. Like when you think
Mm-hmm.
about healers in indigenous societies, and I know you just got back from Mexico, and I mean every country. I mean, it makes me think about just these rich traditions
Yeah.
in places when it comes to healing and healers and how healing was done and the importance of ritual in healing.
Yes.
And so utilizing tarot cards is one way to create a sense of ritual in
Yes.
session. And I think that's important. I think it's
Yeah.
easy for us to get caught in this capitalistic assembly line version of healing, and
Yes.
tarot is, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I could say a lot about this, right? Like, evidence-based modalities, right, are important. Like you said, EMDR, brain spotting, different things are wonderful, wonderful tools. And I certainly advocate for their use, when clinically appropriate and helpful. And as you were saying, people have been healing for millennia, right? Using all kinds of wonderful tools and ways and ways inside. And tarot can be such a, like you said, such an important part of ritual. I know for me personally, when I use tarot, I might use it during my own meditation or contemplation time, right? And
Mm.
it can be just such a wonderful way in. So I want to encourage, whether you're a client or, not a client or a therapist, there's so much room for exploration and to really make this your own, right? Just it can be so wonderfully creative and introspective. But yes, and I would love if you could share, how can people find out more about you and all of the cool things you do? Because I know you do a lot of stuff for therapists with tarot. You see clients. Can you share? And we're going to put this in the notes, but I just want to give you
Oh,
an opportunity to speak to that.
oh, Lisa, thank you. Sure. So I've
Yeah.
got my DreyaBlume.com
Okay.
website. And so I do coaching. I offer workshops and retreats for mostly for therapists who want to learn how to integrate tarot into their clinical work. I also read the cards as an intuitive reader. So I have a separate website, tarotwithdreya.com.
Okay.
That so I do online readings. And then if you're a therapist on Facebook and you're interested, I run a Facebook group called Therapists Who Tarot. And it's
Mm.
just a way to build community among therapists who are interested in learning how to use tarot clinically or who are already using it. And we have pretty regular meetups over Zoom, so a way to connect with other clinicians. So yeah.
Wonderful. That's so great. I know. And I know I've checked out your Facebook group, and I also want to check out tarotwithdreya.com, which I don't think I knew about that, but that's really neat. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks.
And and if you're a client, a therapy client, or you're somebody who's looking for therapy, I have yet to have a client coming to me saying, "Hey, I'm looking for a therapist who knows about astrology and tarot," right? I get a lot of clients who are saying, I'm looking for a holistic therapist who could incorporate my spirituality. I would say to folks, what if people start asking for that? Like, oh, do you work with other spiritual traditions? Do you understand anything about tarot or astrology? Right. So just as a way to kind of really normalize this wonderful tool, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And therapists can say, I'm tarot friendly or I'm alternative spirituality friendly or,
Yeah.
let
Yeah.
people know. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dreya. I appreciate your time, and hopefully, if anyone has any questions, we're going to include all this information in the notes. Feel free to reach out to Dreya. Feel free to reach out to me, and thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Elisa. It was a pleasure.
Okay, thanks.